Well, without further ado, let's meet our speaker, Richard Buggs. Richard, come and join me somewhere here at the front.
Thanks very much.
Richard, do you get a round of applause everywhere you go?
Certainly not, no.
Certainly not, okay. Well,
especially not after the talk, no.
Okay, well, we'll see about that. Richard, for those of us who don't know you, tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm married with 3 children, ages 5, 2, and 4 months. We live in Kew. I work at Kew Gardens 4 days a week, and 1 day a week for Queen Mary, University of London. And I do research on the genetics of trees. We take methods that are developed for understanding human genetics, and we apply them to trees.
And how did you get interested in this whole area of research, sort of evolutionary biology, that sort of stuff?
Well, it was a bit circuitous, really. My dad's a farmer, and when I chose my A-levels, I wanted to be a vet, so I chose biology, chemistry, maths. Then, by the time I'd finished my A-levels, I thought, actually, I want to be a farmer. So I applied for agriculture, but then lots of my friends were applying to Oxbridge, and I thought, oh, I'll just give it a go. So I applied to do natural sciences at Cambridge, and to my surprise, I got in. And so then I did natural sciences, specialized in plants, and I've just found I loved science. Went on to do a PhD, had some very inspirational lecturers along the way, and ended up as a research scientist.
And your time now is split between Kew and Queen Mary University, is that right?
That's right,
What's
yeah.
your particular research in at the moment?
Well, I've been in the field of evolutionary genetics, really, ever since I started my PhD in the year 2000, which is quite a scary thought. So I've been 23 years in evolutionary biology, all of plants. But as a Christian, all the time I've been thinking about the issue, really, that's up on the slide. Does my field of research, evolutionary genetics, actually support atheism or not? And the longer I've been in the field, the more convinced I've become that no, it really doesn't. Darwin doesn't make atheism credible. So
well, thank you so much for coming to join us tonight. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. The floor is now yours.
Thanks very much. Well, thank you all for coming this evening. So, did Darwin make atheism credible? I've already let on that I'm going to say no, he didn't, but I guess if I was going to say any other answer, Tom would probably not have invited me to come and speak to you, to be honest. But yeah, so to understand, well, why do people say that Darwin made atheism credible? Because they do say that. Richard Dawkins, the well-known atheist biologist, said Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. He says, before 1859, when The Origin of Species was published, before 1859, I could not have been an atheist. So clearly, Darwin is doing something really important for Richard Dawkins, and he's doing something really important, I think, for everyone who is an atheist. So what is it that makes atheism possible because of Darwin? Well, the claim is that Darwin gave a response to the argument from design. Darwin made it possible to have design in nature without a designer. Well, what do we mean by design? Well, design is when, very broadly speaking, when something is built with a purpose. Something that's designed had someone who planned it, someone who thought about it, someone who had something in mind for it. And all the way through human history, people have looked at the natural world and thought, that looks very strongly as if it were designed. It has all of the properties I would expect of it if someone had a purpose in mind for it. Someone thought about it and decided it should be there. And I think all of us find that very intuitive. And if we think a little bit about the thought process that goes through our mind when we infer that something is designed, all the time we are thinking in these terms. So, for example, if I spot the same person walking behind me 5 times in the same week, I immediately ask myself, well, is that an accident that I've seen that same person behind me? Or is this happening by design? Are they stalking me? Another example is, well, if I walk into my living room, which with 3 kids I can tell you is often quite chaotic, and I see these bits of brio lying on the floor, this wooden train set. If they're arranged like that, I think, well, no one had any plan or design when they put those pieces of brio there. Now, actually, in this instance, to be honest, I did put them out very deliberately in a way that looks random, so I did have a purpose, but you can't detect that purpose because it's such a motley arrangement. But if on the other hand, these were lying here in a perfect circle, all put together into a small train set, and I spend a lot of my time building train sets, so this comes very naturally. If I walked into my living room and this was on the floor with that on top of it, I would immediately think, well, someone had a purpose for that. Someone wanted a train set where they could push the train round and it would go in a circle. Clearly that is designed. It has a purpose. It is planned. And all the time in our lives we're thinking in those terms, aren't we? Was that an accident or was it done on purpose? And when we look at the natural world, it strikes us as obvious that it must have a purpose. My hands are wonderfully designed for me to be able to grasp things. My mouth is amazingly designed for me to eat things. Grass is amazingly designed to grow and provide fodder for crops. Trees are amazingly designed to grow up and capture light and outcompete other things that don't have woody material. And so all through human history, people have looked at the natural world and said, well, somebody wanted us to be here. This is designed. You can even see it in the books that you have on your tables. These are Matthew's Gospels, the biography of Jesus, 2,000 years ago. And if you just look at page 16, this is chapter 6 of Matthew's Gospel. This is in the very famous passage, often called the Sermon on the Mount. If you look on page 16 and verse 28, which is about 3/4 of the way down the page, Jesus says, "Why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon, in all his glory, was not arrayed like one of these." And so what Jesus is doing there is he thinks it's obvious that when you look at a beautiful flower, you compare it to human craftsmanship. And the craftsmanship he chooses to compare it to is the clothing of Solomon, who was the king of Israel when Israel was at its most wealthy and most artistically inclined, and when they had the resources to invest in craftsmanship and art. And he says that even at the height of art in our culture, even Solomon, the king at that time, he wasn't dressed like one of these flowers. And so Jesus is just assuming that people will look at flowers and think, well, this is something that is made by God. God made and designed flowers. And Jesus was far from alone in making that inference. As I say, it comes very intuitively to all of us. But if you look at someone like Socrates, he would look at a statue of a human being and he would say to his followers, look, if you look at a statue, you can't but admire the artistry and the skill of the person who made that statue. But then compare that stone statue to a human body, and you have to admit that whoever made a human body must be much more intelligent and much more skillful than the person who made the statue. And so this argument is one from analogy. We see this analogy between human craftsmanship and the natural world, and that causes us to infer the existence of a designer who is much more intelligent and much more powerful than we are. Just this week in the news, there's been a picture taken of Mars where there's something that looks like the face of a bear. You've probably all seen it. It was one of the videos of the day on the BBC app as I was coming in. And there's this series of craters and a hill in the middle, and it looks remarkably like the face of a bear. And of course, the thought goes through everyone's mind, well, could it have been some intelligence on Mars that deliberately wanted the shape of a bear there? But you can obviously see, no, it's just a chance happening of these different asteroid impacts that have made this shape that looks like a bear. But if you think about it, the search for the SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, is a search looking for design out there in the universe. We're looking for patterns of radio waves that look designed. They don't look as if they're by chance. And if we should find them, we would infer that there was an intelligence out there. We don't know what that intelligence is. We don't know if it's little green men or something else. But the whole premise of the SETI program is that design is detectable. And that's exactly what we're doing when we look at the natural world and think, that must have been designed by someone who is fantastically intelligent. And who could that be except God? So that's the design argument. And that has been one of the most compelling arguments for the existence of God throughout all of human history. So what did Darwin do that undermined the design argument? Well, he came up with the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection. And the claim that's made is that Darwinian natural selection enables us to explain away this appearance of design by a process that had no design. It had no purpose, it had no plan, it had no foresight, but it generated things that look as if they were designed. And if that's true, obviously that is a massive blow to arguments for God's existence. And so let me just illustrate the argument, the mechanism, with reference to a Brio train set. Now, if I walked into our living room and found this on the floor, as I say, I wouldn't think this just happened by chance. If I told my wife I thought this had happened by chance, she would think I was crazy. However, imagine that there was some kind of mechanism that was throwing around bits of Brio train set all of the time. My sons are a bit like that, but they do have some intelligence, so I can't sort of invoke them in this. But imagine there was some sort of blind mechanism that was just throwing around bits of Brio. Well, it would be very unlikely for them all to fall into a perfect circle where all 8 of them are attached to each other. That just wouldn't happen, would it, by chance? But sometimes by chance, 2 of them are going to join up. That's something that we could believe could happen by chance. If I walked into the room and there were 2 there amidst a pile of other ones, I think, oh, those 2 just happened to fall together into 2 pieces together. Now imagine that there is something that's completely blind and mindless, but something that just means when 2 of these get attached together, something says, well, that's better than one being on its own. So keep that. So everything else can be thrown around, but these have to stay together. Then by chance, you could imagine that at some point in the future, another piece purely by chance is going to be added to it. And then let's say, well, that has to be kept. And then 1,000 more iterations might happen, and eventually, another piece by chance gets added, and then maybe we have to wait 500 iterations, and another bit gets added. And what we've done is we've broken down something that on its own is highly improbable, something that you would need purpose and design to achieve. We've broken it down into lots of minute steps, each of them improbable, but not so improbable that we think it's impossible. And so what that means is you can build up something that looks designed by a process that doesn't have any design, it doesn't have any purpose. And the Darwinian mechanism, it's claimed, can, by that sort of process, explain how we got here. So all living things have variations that happen at every generation, and some of them happen to make the organism, the individual that has those small changes slightly better, slightly fitter, slightly more able to survive and reproduce. And that means their advantageous mutation, this change that's advantageous, gets passed on to their offspring, and onto their offspring, and gradually it spreads throughout the whole population, and then it gets fixed, and then generations later, something else comes along that's slightly advantageous, and then eventually that gets selected for and fixed. And so over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, by tiny changes, each of them small enough to happen purely by chance, you build up incredible complexity. And the thing that I really have to stress is, and that process doesn't have any direction, it doesn't have any foresight, it doesn't have any goal. It wasn't trying to create human beings. It wasn't trying to produce rabbits and foxes and monkeys and grass and trees. It just happened to produce those things by this mindless process. It didn't have to produce them, but it just happens that it did. And so Richard Dawkins and other atheists would say, well, look, this argument completely blows out of the water the argument from design. We don't need God anymore. We don't need purpose. We can have complex things without God. And it sounds very convincing. And of course, in Victorian England, when people read Darwin's Origin of Species, at the time people were looking around for scientific explanations of the world that would allow them to ditch the idea of God. And his arguments were plausible enough for people to think, well, this sounds believable. Let's ditch the idea of God. And so many of the intelligentsia did do that. There was a really strong movement at the time to try to make everything scientific and to get rid of the power and authority of organized religion. But I think now in the 21st century, with all of the progress we've made in science in the last 150 years, we have to re-examine whether this really is a credible mechanism. And I want to give you 3 reasons why I've become convinced that this mechanism does not explain how we got here, and doesn't do away with the design argument, and doesn't do away with our need of a creative superintelligence, otherwise known as God. I could give more reasons, but for the sake of time, I'll just stick to 3. Now, one of them is, and let me return to the illustration, we had to have a mechanism that was throwing around our bits of brio and keeping the slightly longer bits of railway track. And that, in the analogy, that is what life does. So when we reproduce, we pass on information in our DNA, and then that is slightly mutated, and then our children, they reproduce as well. And because we're living and reproducing, this evolutionary process can happen. But it cannot happen until you have living things. It can't happen until you have things that are autonomously able to reproduce themselves. Until that point, you don't have the Darwinian mechanism. So we have the problem of the origin of life. Now, in Darwin's time, it seemed like a pretty simple issue. In fact, people believed in spontaneous generation up until 1859, when Pasteur showed that it couldn't happen. People thought that mold just sort of appeared on bread, that life just spontaneously arose. But now we know that doesn't happen. And now we know a lot more about life and its mechanisms. And we know that even the most simple life forms have the most intricate machinery that enables them to work. They have nanotechnology with them, which is just mind-blowing. Imagine that you had to make a robot that could self-replicate from raw materials it found in its environment. It's hard even to imagine how you would do that and how complex that robot would be. But that's what life is. Life is like a miniature robot that is able to replicate itself. That involves staggering complexity. But the Darwinian mechanism doesn't work until you've got that. And so someone like Dawkins can only say, well, that must have just happened by chance. But how could chance give you a nano machine that can replicate itself? I think there, at the very least, we have a signature of design and a great need for God to be there to get things going in the first place. Another reason I'd give is that for the Darwinian mechanism to work, every complex bit of that molecular machinery that we find in life today has to be able to evolve by a step-by-step process where every step of the process is only slightly different than what was there before, and also confers a fitness advantage, also makes it better at doing what it does. So imagine I asked you to design a car where once you had the chassis and wheels, so once you had something that could actually move along, you were going to add complexity until it could do everything that a Tesla can do, except that every step that you go has to be a tiny step, and every step has to slightly enhance the functionality of the car. I don't think you could do it, could you? Because you know that there are certain components of a car where until every bit of that is in place, it doesn't really help the functioning of the car. You have to have foresight, you have to have a purpose when you put the pieces together, saying, I know this isn't helping the car at the moment, but it will in the future when I've got 110 different parts all in place in exactly the right way. And when we look at the nanotechnology inside ourselves, it looks very much like the kind of machinery that you could not build up by a step-by-step process. There are so many interlocking parts that all have to work together. For example, in all of our cells, we have many, many copies of a small turbine, and it sits on a membrane, and there's a flow of hydrogen ions that go through it, and as they go through, they drive this turbine round. And as it goes round, it changes the conformation of some of the molecules around it and enables something called ADP to be turned into ATP, and that's how energy is transported around the cell. This is called ATP synthase. Just discovering the structure of ATP synthase won someone the Nobel Prize. No one knows how that could have evolved. No one can even imagine a step-by-step pathway, with each step just being really small, but each step conferring an advantage by which something like that could evolve. And there are many, many other examples of highly complex bits of nanotechnology in our cells for which no one can imagine an evolutionary pathway. Now, of course, in Darwin's time, the cell just looked like something really simple. He had no idea it was containing the kind of nanotechnology that it does. It was credible maybe back then, but today, in the 21st century, I don't think that's credible. And then finally, I can see I'm running out of time. Within the field of evolutionary biology itself, among people who are studying changes over time in natural populations that we can actually see, people studying evolution in real time, we find increasingly that the changes we see are not being driven by the Darwinian process, but they're being driven by other processes that actually rely on very complex mechanisms within organisms that they have to enable them to adapt to their environments. And so even within the field of evolutionary biology, this Darwinian mechanism is becoming less and less significant, and other mechanisms are becoming more significant. And so I see even within evolutionary biology a trend away from the Darwinian mechanism. And so for these and other reasons, I've just come to the conclusion that there is absolutely no way that Darwin makes atheism credible. Yes, Darwin was a great scientist. Yes, he made huge contributions to science. Yes, many of his ideas are still valid today. But does he make atheism possible? Absolutely not. Now, some of you might think, well, that's not great news because it actually raises more questions than it answers. I mean, if there really is a God, then that is perhaps a sort of disturbing thought. And I then have to sort of think through, well, what about this earthquake that has just happened? How does that fit in with God's existence, if he exists? But I would just refer you back to the passage I looked at in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus makes this analogy between biology and human craftsmanship. Now, Jesus isn't saying this to persuade us of God's existence. He just assumes that we find this persuasive of God's existence. He's actually saying this, if you look in the context, to try and persuade us not to be anxious. He goes on to say, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Therefore do not be anxious, saying, what can we eat? Or what can we drink? Or what can we wear? And he goes on to tell them to seek God and not be anxious about tomorrow. And this is profoundly comforting, isn't it, in the world in which we live, where there's so much to cause us anxiety. But Jesus is saying, look, you are here with a purpose. You're not here as the result of a purposeless, blind, natural process that didn't have you in mind. You're not just something that happened and has no meaning. You're someone who God had a purpose for. God had a purpose for this world. He had a purpose for human beings. He has a purpose for us. And to know him is actually something which can take away our anxieties. And I find that profoundly encouraging and comforting in my life. And I hope that if you're wrestling with these issues, that you can come to a knowledge of God that gives you a similar comfort and purpose. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you very much. As we said at the start, we're now going to have a short break just to top up our glasses and nips to loo or something like that. So in a few minutes' time, we'll start our Q&A. Details of how to submit your questions are up on the screen. Some people have already been doing that. Do get your questions in, and we'll get going in about 3 or 4 minutes' time. Great. Well, I think we'll get going again there. It's worth saying at this stage that Richard got us to turn up a little page in this copy of Matthew's Gospel. You should find some of these around the room. These are our gift from us to you. They're free to take away. They are eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. And if you've never read one, a copy of the Gospel as an adult, I would really commend it to you. Please do feel free to take those away. Now, we've got lots of questions coming in. You can keep them coming in via Slido. Richard, I'm going to invite you up to join me again. Richard, thank you so much for a really stimulating talk. We've got loads of questions here. Let's just kick off with this one. If the arguments for intelligent design are so strong, why are not all biologists Christians? What are their main objections?
Yeah, that's a good question. Oh, there's lots of ways to come at that. I think a lot of biologists think in design terms without necessarily saying they believe in intelligent design. So biologists will very often look at something in biology and say, what is that there for? You look at a certain gene and say, well, what is that gene for? What is the purpose of that gene? You don't find an astronomer saying, what is Mars there for? What's the purpose of Mars? But in biology, people are always talking in terms of purpose. Well, why does that organism have that appendage? What's that there for? And so teleological thinking about things having a purpose and an end, is absolutely rife throughout biology. And a lot of discovery in biology happens because biologists think, well, what is that there for? If I were a designer, how would I design it? And then you make sense of the complex things you see in a cell. And so there's this strange disjunct that design thinking is going on all the time, but there's a great unwillingness to say there is an intelligent designer. And there are several reasons for that unwillingness. One is that there are very sort of well-known and powerful figures in biology who have a very strong atheist agenda, who want to sort of stamp on anyone who says that kind of thing. I've experienced a bit of that myself. Another aspect is people often think about science as having a set of rules that mean you can never invoke anything that could be supernatural within science. So science is defined as only appealing to natural causation. And so the only types of explanation you're allowed to consider within science are natural ones. And so God is ruled out from the outset. And so there might be Christian scientists who believe in God, but they think, well, when I'm doing science, I can never possibly invoke him or think he could be doing something. He's sort of not in that space. And so I can only think so it becomes a bit of a sort of game almost. I can only think in natural terms here, even though within my own worldview, I'm happy not to think in natural terms. Personally, I see science as being based on natural world evidence, but not necessarily having to be about natural world causation. And I think the founders of modern science had that view of science, that it was looking at evidence from the natural world, but if the evidence strongly suggested causation that was not natural, then that was fine. And early scientists, the people who really got modern science going, were very much of that view. I think another part of this, why don't more people say, well, it was designed, is, in a sense, familiarity breeds contempt. You get so used to looking at these highly complex mechanisms and the digital information encoded in genomes that you lose a sense of the wonder of it. I can remember, I was sort of in my second year as an undergraduate, going to lectures about cell biology, and I suddenly realized I've lost all sense of wonder at these incredibly complex mechanisms that we're learning about all the time, because I've just got so used to it. You just get used to life being like that, and you stop thinking about it, unfortunately.
Thank you, Richard. Just a quick follow-up. Are there biologists who are Christians, or is it just you?
Definitely. No, there are others. There are others. I think, though, there are sociological reasons why there are not more Christians in evolutionary biology. I think one of them is that if you're Christian and you're choosing a degree and you're good at biology, you'll often choose to do medicine. I see that a lot. And churches will sort of push people in a medical direction rather than an evolutionary biology direction. And it's partly because the word evolution has so many meanings in our culture that for some people, evolution almost means atheism. For others, it just means a change in gene frequencies in a population over time. And so, because for some people, evolution has really negative associations, if they're from a Christian background, that sort of puts people off. And so I think there's sociological reasons why there are not more Christians in biology. And there's also sociological reasons why a lot of atheists want to do biology, because they see it as something that can sort of help them and bolster them as an atheist, a bit like a Christian wanting to go and do theology, or something like that.
What is the probability that by chance primitive cells form? I.e., how many iterations and years of iteration would you need for such a cell to develop?
I just think it could not happen by chance. There's this famous analogy that Sir Fred Hoyle had about a tornado in a junkyard making a Boeing 747. It is like that. It just could not happen by chance. And one of the elements I didn't talk about is that for many of the molecules in life, they're able to have a right-handed form and a left-handed form. And when a natural process makes those molecules, it makes a mix of both the right-handed and the left-handed form. Somehow in life, you have to only have one of those forms. And how you sort out those two things is a massive problem for any origin of life study. And so, I think it's just impossible. If you want to hear someone talking about this with more authority than me, there's a very senior scientist called James Tour at Rice University in the States. And if you search for James Tour, that's T-O-U-R, Origin of Life, you can get his take on it. And he is a synthetic chemist. He's won competitions for nanotechnological machines that he's built. So he knows what he's on about, and he has looked quite carefully at this and concluded that it just couldn't happen by chance.
Thank you. The natural world is amazing, but very cruel. Whether it came about by design or evolution, doesn't it point to a cruel creator rather than one who is loving? And we've got a couple of other questions like that about bad design and God's responsibility. What would you say to that?
Well, I don't think it negates the argument from design itself. It raises a further question. I think the argument for design works whether God himself is benign or cruel. as you've gathered, I believe he's benign because of what Jesus says there. And there are lots of just incredible and amazing and beautiful things about the world around us that strongly suggest he's benign. But yes, that there are bad things too, and I guess that's where the theologians have to help us out. So perhaps I should bat that one back
Thanks.
to Tom as a theologian.
Well, it's a good question, and it's worth saying that the Bible gives us a whole framework for understanding the world and the world in which we live. But one way of reconciling these things would be to look at the cross of Jesus. And at the cross of Jesus, we see that the God of the Bible is not cruel. He's actually self-giving, and he loves people who reject him enough to die for them. And that makes me think, as a Christian, as I look at the cross of Jesus, actually I'm not dealing with a God who's out to get me. I'm dealing with a God who is positively for me. And that still leaves me with questions. And you can come on Christianity Explored if you wanted to ask those. But that gives me some sort of framework for thinking that God is not cruel. I can see there might be a God, but why does that mean I have to believe in Jesus? Or another question is, why are you a Christian, not just a sort of theist?
Well, I think it starts with theism, but I think once you're persuaded that there is a God, then it's reasonable to think, well, has he tried to communicate with us? You know, if he's gone to all that effort of producing us and making this world and making us and giving us the amazing intelligence and emotional life and artistry and ability that we have, has he himself tried to communicate with us? And of course, there are quite a few contenders out there claiming to be communications from God, and I think it's logical to look at each of them and think, well, which one is most credible? And insofar that I've done that, I find the Christianity, particularly the New Testament, the most credible, to have the most believable claim to being God revealing himself to us. And so I wouldn't claim, I can't look at a flower and say, well, Jesus is the Son of God. I have to get that from God's revelation, of course, but I think there are good reasons for thinking that God has revealed himself to us in the Bible. I'm sure Tom would say, if you go on Christianity Explored, you can
solve all your problems.
You can hear more about
Come
that.
along, bring any of your life problems, we'll sort them out. This is a good one. To what extent does your surname inform your desire to study natural sciences?
Well, I should have become an entomologist rather than a botanist, but it certainly helps.
Is that to do with bugs? I don't know what
yeah.
an entomologist is. Splendid.
It certainly helps.
To what extent is your belief in God based on science versus, I guess, spirituality? It's a spiritual. Do you find your work in science helps to reiterate or contradict your Christian beliefs?
I find my work in science has actually been a great help to my Christian beliefs. And partly because of this very question, because if I begin to have doubts, I think, well, the leap of faith involved in believing that this could all have come about by a mindless and purposeless process is actually a huge leap of faith. In some ways, a bigger leap of faith than my Christianity is. And so it encourages me to keep going as a Christian. But yeah, the question implies that there are other reasons for being a Christian apart from just the evidence from the biological world. There are internal reasons as well. There's one's own personal experience that of course plays into it, and I wouldn't disclaim that for a moment.
If God is the engineer behind Darwinian evolution, would that not mean that the entire story of Genesis had to be allegorical?
Say that again?
If God is the engineer behind Darwinian evolution, would that not mean that the entire story of Genesis had to be allegorical?
Oh, I see, yeah. I wasn't arguing that God is the engineer behind evolution, in that I'm not saying that we came about by a Darwinian process that God somehow guided. I'm saying there are certain things like the origin of life where an evolutionary mechanism simply is not there to explain it. And so I think that the most obvious explanation for that would be some kind of divine intervention that starts life, at the very least. And when you look at Genesis chapter 1, it is a series of divine interventions. And so I think there's a certain amount of compatibility there between those two views. Another one I'd point to is human consciousness. You know, I referred to the amazing abilities we have. You know, they're far in excess of what we need to survive and reproduce. Very hard to see how any Darwinian explanation could be adequate to explain the human mind. You know, we don't even know how the human mind works. We don't know how it interacts with the brain. If we don't know how it works, we're even further away from an explanation of how it evolved. And I think there the most credible thing is some kind of divine intervention giving us human consciousness.
Is it worth saying as well that the Bible is more concerned with telling us that God created us and we're therefore accountable to him than it is in telling us precisely how God created us? So the question made it sound as if the entire book of Genesis, 50 chapters long, was a narrative about how God created the world, and it's not actually true. It's one chapter is written telling us how God created the universe, and there's 49 chapters about people in that universe.
Yeah.
So.
And you know, not to play down the significance of what the Bible is saying, it's also important to remember the Bible isn't there as a scientific textbook. You know, God didn't write the Bible to inform us about the germ theory of disease and how to make fire. And, you know, there's lots of really useful things that God doesn't tell us in the Bible. And this came home to me quite powerfully, actually, as an undergraduate. We had just been learning about ways of classifying plants, and one of the big differences is between angiosperms and gymnosperms, and the technical definition of those is gymnosperms have a seed that is not covered, whereas angiosperms have a seed that is covered, often by a fruit. And as a student, I was looking at Genesis chapter 1, where it says God made plants that have fruit with seeds in them and plants that have seeds. I can't remember the exact thing. And I said to my tutor, who was the director of the Botanic Garden in Cambridge, during a tutorial, I said, do you think that in Genesis could be angiosperms and gymnosperms? And he very wisely didn't dismiss me at all, didn't say, oh, you know, why are you reading the Bible? He said, well, this is really interesting, but no, because I think that Genesis was written for agrarian people who were farmers without modern scientific knowledge, and it's just telling them that things that you eat as a fruit were created by God, and things that you eat as a seed were created by God. And it's not trying to tell them about modern science. He wasn't a Christian himself, but was just giving a sort of common sense answer. And as I thought about it, I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense. Why would God be sort of revealing to them a modern scientific classification rather than just the way talking to them about the world as they see it as farming people with no modern science? And so it sort of taught me not to just view the Bible as something that you can simply transpose onto modern science.
The arguments you've put forward today seem to qualify Darwin's theory, i.e. they just add a creator component to it. Are you open to the possibility that Darwin's theory may be completely wrong?
Well, it's not completely wrong, because there are lots of things that it does explain very nicely. I've just been doing a study on natural selection in a woodland in Surrey, where we're looking for the effects of the ash dieback fungus on the population of ash trees and detecting a change in gene frequencies driven by natural selection. And in a way, that's a really nice illustration of the Darwinian mechanism. And, you know, that's great. You know, that's really cool. And so it's very hard to see how that couldn't be correct. I mean, this is the kind of thing that we can go out there and measure. I think the things that are much harder to believe are the massive extrapolations and the huge leaps of faith that say, well, that mechanism is adequate to make the complex molecular machinery of cells. It's enough to explain human consciousness. These kind of things, I think, go far, far beyond what we can actually show the Darwinian process doing. But the Darwinian process is here to stay.
If current technology can reproduce life artificially, are the creators of these technologies God?
Well, no one has been able to artificially make life. Somebody claimed a few years ago to have made an artificial cell and an artificial genome, but what they had done is simply copied living genomes. The original thing was they had made the actual DNA molecule itself from scratch, but had copied the design of the DNA code from a living thing. So it wasn't them making life, it was them copying life. If human beings make amazing machines, whether they be at the nanoscale or at the macro scale, they are doing creative work that is somewhat analogous to the work that God does, work of creative intelligence. That makes them creators with a small c, but it doesn't make them God. I think the whole point of God is that not only is he so super intelligent and powerful that he's able to do these things, but also he is himself the uncaused cause. He is the sort of end of any possible infinite regress. And that's, I think in Christian theology, that's what's so important about him, that he is eternal and self-existent, and we don't need any explanation for him.
I thought I had a question come in just now, but it's actually my football team's just scored a goal. So I think we can all agree that we can rejoice and be glad. I think we've got about time for one more question, so let's run with this one. Fundamentally, do you agree that science and religion have to meet somewhere in the middle, or do you believe they are too different to coexist?
I disagree with both of them. So I don't see them as two things that have to meet in the middle, nor do I see them as two things that can just have to be in parallel and never meet. I see them as two things that should be able to mesh perfectly together. And that is the view of the people who invented modern science. They said, well, look, we have the book of God's word, and we have the book of God's creation. And if we read both of them correctly, then they're going to mesh together perfectly. Now, of course, that's not easy to do. I can't tell you exactly how they mesh together, but I think ultimately, in principle, they can. And that's what I would be wanting ultimately to be working towards, although I don't think we're going to get there in my lifetime.
Richard, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real joy. Should we give Richard a round of applause?